Kate Milafalcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen, and welcome to returning guest Larry Jordan. Back by popular demand, Larry. People really enjoyed what you had to say about your book. Ooh, I'm too weak. The Real Marilyn Monroe, great book, absolutely fantastic. Lots of new information. Thanks for coming back.
I'm delighted to be with you again. I enjoyed it.
I'm very eager to get into this.
Yeah.
When last we left Marilyn,
Yes.
we talked about her childhood.
Mhm.
Then I don't remember what we talked about. We managed to fill close to 2 hours. So as I was telling Larry, I have a roughly 5.5, 6 pads here of notes when I synopsize the book. I got through the first 2 and I have 28 pages of questions. So we're going to take a little different approach, and I'm going to throw this to Larry and maybe just toss out an idea, and he can fill us in on the details. And I thought maybe it would be fun to start with her really broken picker. She had a broken picker when it came to marriages. She had the young one when she was 16. What's his name? Doherty?
Yes, James Doherty.
And then Joe DiMaggio.
Yes.
And Arthur Miller.
Yes.
Which is such an interesting combination of people until you realize how smart she was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So emotional intelligence and IQ don't always go along, but
True.
So why don't you start? I know you had something you wanted to say about her first marriage.
Well, Jim Doherty wasn't a bad fellow. They did have a close relationship when he was home, but he left her alone too much. You know, as we talked last time, he enlisted in the military without telling her, which of course would be a trauma. I bet every wife that had that situation would be a little bit annoyed, and particularly one that was like Marilyn, who was so vulnerable and was a lonely, kind of cast-off individual anyway. But he was unyielding. You know, she had the opportunity because of the photographs that were taken by David Conover of her, and she was kind of launching her career as a model. She wrote letters to Jim Doherty, who was off in the South Pacific somewhere, but occasionally got letters from her. She described to him what she was doing, and he gave his blessing. He thought that was fine, although he commented that she wiped out their bank account to buy all these clothes and also pay for the modeling lessons from Emmeline Snively. But anyway, he was good-natured about that until it started to consume more and more of her time. He came home one Christmas and she wasn't there. She was out on a photo shoot.
Yeah.
And with the name, I think it's Andre de Dennis. I may be pronouncing that wrong.
Yeah.
He was actually introduced. The photographer was a big-time photographer, but he instantly took a liking to her in more than one way. But he convinced her to accompany him up along the coast of
California. They went on a road trip, right?
Yes, indeed. And she resisted his appeal, except one night when there was just no other accommodation during a snowstorm, and they ended up sharing a room. And I think she immediately felt guilty about it. She was not even home for Christmas when her husband got leave, and that was very traumatic for both of them. And that was really kind of the first sign that to Jim Doherty that things were not blissful on the home front. But anyway, she did end up refusing to have anything more to do with Andre for a while.
A long time,
for
yeah.
A while.
Yeah.
He ultimately did shoot photos of her in later years. But anyway, what happened basically was Marilyn wanted to pursue the career in movies, but they would not hire a woman that was married. So Marilyn, then known as Norma Jean, proposed to her husband, Jimmy, that they go ahead and get divorced, but secretly live together. So she argued that nothing would really change. The studio wouldn't have to know. In fact, this is probably a case where other actresses have done the same thing. I'm sure that's true. So it wasn't actually a big, scandalous thing, but he refused to go along with that. It was either him or nothing. And he forced her to make a choice. So he lost out. He was, I don't know whether he ever regretted that in life, but I think it was a big mistake on his part. because he did care about her and vice versa.
Well, they
But
were
he
both
had a choice.
really young. I mean, he
Yes,
was
they
older
were.
than she was, but they were both really young and they were apart for so long. And it was, I think, symptomatic of the time that the woman just kind of tailed along. Like
Yes,
Catalina, they spent that time in
right.
Catalina. That was his job, but
Hmm.
she, followed him there and immediately got a following of all
Yeah,
these military guys that trailed along behind her.
right.
I think that was normal. Women were expected to be subservient.
Well, there were also pictures that exist of her with young children, and she fraternized with other housewives. I don't want to leave the implication that she was fooling around behind her husband's back with any of the guys on Catalina Island, but
No, no.
it was the fact that notably she was the one trying to make the accommodation so they could stay together.
Yeah.
And facing the prospect of either breaking up or compromising with Marilyn, he chose breaking up, basically, forced her hand. She went to Nevada, where she remained for a little while to get a quickie divorce, and bye bye, Jimmy.
I
So,
don't think that she was ever deceptive or duplicitous about her relationships. Uh, I mean, she did things behind people's backs, but it was behind their backs, under their noses. There was sort of an understanding, don't you think? And she did attract a lot of male attention. I don't, it wasn't, I think it was unintentional a lot of the time. She had some charisma.
yeah.
And so you're talking about married women with a lot of little children. And if I remember correctly, in those days, once you were married, you were always pregnant, and so
Oh, I'm not to interrupt. I'm glad you brought that up. She wanted to get pregnant by Jim Doherty, and he refused. He wanted her assurance that she was not going to pursue the modeling or the career in movies, and then maybe he'd consider it. So she wanted to form a family with him,
yeah.
but he put the kibosh on that too. So in a way, she was trying to maintain at least the appearance of a traditional relationship, a traditional marriage, even though technically they might have had to get divorced to fool the studio. She still wanted to be with him, and that's what's heartbreaking. I
It's
don't think
very
she
sad,
ever
yeah.
completely resolved her feelings of loss when their marriage broke up.
Well, she had that kind of all pervasive sense of abandonment from her childhood trauma. And she really wanted to have children. She talked about it quite a bit.
Oh,
But
oh,
every time that possibility got a little closer, it was taken away from her through no fault of her own, I believe. And she didn't have a lot of agency or control over that. So she opted for something else to
yes.
fulfill her. I don't think, I would never blame her for that. She didn't sit home and go into the depths of despair. She
Oh,
pursued her professional interests.
absolutely.
So then there was Joe DiMaggio. Let's talk about that psycho.
Well,
Allegedly.
I told you off camera that I did not put it in the book, but I actually met Joe DiMaggio
Yeah.
in the 1970s by some quirk of circumstances. I was friends with a guy who knew one of Joe DiMaggio's buddies, and Joe was coming to my area on business, and I was invited to tag along when he was going to have breakfast. So I did. I was literally warned in advance, don't mention Marilyn Monroe. So, it kind of circumscribed my desire to ask him a question. But anyway, I felt now I can't claim to have had engaged in an extensive conversation with Mr. DiMaggio, although he did sit across from me as we all had breakfast. But he was lighthearted and, cracking jokes. He seemed to be a down to earth sort of guy. But what I noticed about him was he was painfully shy, which struck me as a bit strange considering the fact he had been a very successful with the New York Yankees pro ball player, performed, in front of millions of people on TV and in the stadium. So he was used to a lot of public attention. Yet when you got him alone, he was very shy and soft spoken. He was not some backslapping extrovert. And I always remembered that because I felt like, when Marilyn was interviewed about her having met Joe, there was a blind date situation set up. She didn't even really want to meet him when she found out he was an athlete. But to her surprise, he shows up in a neatly tailored gray suit, blue tie, a little bit of gray at the temples. He was then in his 40s. And she was taken aback. She didn't expect this ball player to be so well groomed, so polite, so solicitous of her. So he won her over initially by her shyness. But note that they dated for about 2 years. She did not jump into a marriage with Joe DiMaggio. And ultimately, we find out that behind the scenes, he was very demanding. He did rather soon take her up to San Francisco, where his Italian family lived. He introduced her to the whole big, family. They were an Italian family. They were actually very discriminated against. The DiMaggios had a restaurant up there near Fisherman's Wharf. And during war years, we had some strange policies, some of which seem to be revisited these days in demonizing certain groups of people. But anyway, they were not, the Italians were for a while not allowed to go out and fish, yet they had a restaurant that served seafood. So right away, Marilyn was kind of sucked into their world and their political world of feeling sorry for this big, large, friendly, gregarious, welcoming family. And Joe was just a part of it. Although surely Marilyn knew from the outset that with Joe's demands that she, become the traditional wife that cooked and cleaned and all this stuff, and what was at his beck and call, that this was never going to be their relationship. So it is a bit puzzling that she chose to marry him, because he never, till his dying day, ever gave up on the notion.
I don't think it's puzzling at all. I disagree with you. I don't think it's puzzling. I think she married his family. I think she was absolutely enthralled with the notion of a big, cohesive, happy family. Look at how solicitous she was of his father until the day his father died.
That was actually the father of Arthur Miller.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
So she didn't keep close to
well, she was, she got to know a sister and people that were members of the family. And I agree with you to the extent that she loved that family element.
Yes.
And there's pictures of them, going there. And he took her out to, there's wonderful pictures where he was showing her around and that sort of thing. And she liked that. Yeah. What I'm saying is that that's well and good, but she was unrealistic and not very practical about the idea that he wanted her to give up her career to be able to be inculcated with that family. Yeah. So on the one level, she liked that family atmosphere, but gee, did she stop and think, oh, to have that, I'm going to have to give up my career? I mean, did that thought not occur to her?
I think that she compartmentalized it or something. I think that I'll use the word primal, that really primal need to mend the trauma of her child. I left my psychiatric diploma in the other room, but I really do think, because of her upbringing and her abandonment and her sense of not having a family, I think that drew her, because I just on a personal level, what you wrote about him, I can't understand it. He was controlling. And if nothing else, verbally abusive, and he stalked her.
Well, remember, the marriage only lasted about 9 months. And you may recall that she was in New York at one point filming the 7-Year Itch, the famous skirt blowing scene.
Yeah, that was an interesting
I go into that rather extensively. Walter Winchell, a very popular columnist, was a good friend of Joe's. Well, maybe I should temper that description, because I don't think a good friend would have goaded Joe to go and witness the actual filming, knowing that his friend Joe was so insanely jealous. And I do mean insanely jealous of Marilyn.
He was hoping for a story.
Well, that's exactly right. And he got one. The night, everybody knows, that scene. I'm sure they may not know that this was promoted in the press in the days leading up to the filming. The Hollywood crew was there, Marilyn, and her I think it was Tom Ewell, that was her.
That's right. Yeah.
And they had shot at or cordoned off parts of the streets in New York and Manhattan. And my friend James Haspiel, the guy that we haven't yet really fully explored, but he befriended her when he was young and knew her the final 8 years of her life. He was very good about elbowing his way to the front of a crowd. That's how he met Marilyn originally.
Oh, he's a character.
Even he had trouble getting close the night they were filming that scene, because even behind police lines, there were so many people. James ended up going to an upper floor of a building and looking over the scene. As it turns out, that film footage was never used in the final film. It was reshot on a Hollywood soundstage. But this is all a PR trick,
right,
to interest the public. But anyway, Joe stood there and watched the scene where they did this over and over again, where they had a fan underneath a subway grate, and on cue it would blow her skirt up and so forth. And even though she was wearing a couple of pairs of undergarments, it was offensive to Joe that he was observing this. And Walter Winchell did talk about this after everything was done and the crowd had dissipated. They actually went into the theater where Marilyn had her feet up, her shoes off, and was relaxing, and welcomed her husband, Joe, warmly. Giuseppe, I think, or Giuseppe, that's what she called him, an Italian name. That was her nickname for him. Walter Winchell.
Well, that's Joseph in Italian.
Yeah, I guess that's, yeah. And she was planning to fly back. The schedule was she was going to fly back to Hollywood the next day because they were done filming. And she was shocked and a little dismayed to find out that her husband was going to remain behind because he wanted to attend the World Series. Now, there again, there's a certain incompatibility of the two.
Yeah.
I can understand why, as a big ball player, though retired, he'd want to see the World Series. He was in town to do that. And she was very resentful of that. Well, that night, there was more brewing underneath the surface there. And that night, of course, in the hotel, people heard the yells, the screaming, and so forth. The next morning, Marilyn had bruises on her shoulders, according to the crew and the makeup artist. So Joe DiMaggio laid his hands on her. And when she got back to California, they took separate floors in this beautiful home that still exists out there that they had been renting. He was on one floor, she remained on the other. And they had, this was the beginning of the end. She was not going to tolerate somebody manhandling her. Now, the question is, was this the first time? I suspect it wasn't, but it was the final time that he got by with it. There was one night, as I report in the book, not long after they both returned to California, where Marilyn late at night put on her top coat. It was kind of chilly. She went moseying on down an alley and ended up at the house of columnist Luella Parsons, who was a great friend of hers, and kind of cried on her shoulder, told her the story of the breakup, the impending breakup of the marriage. And Luella wrote a very sympathetic column. And Luella earned some real brownie points when she did that. It presented, it wasn't hostile really to Joe, but it did surprisingly reveal enough about their relationship that the general public could get a grasp on that. And then, of course, Marilyn chose Jerry Geisler as the attorney to represent her, which was a signal to Joe in more ways than one. I will jump ahead and tell you that in my book, I acknowledge the truth that may upset some fans, and that is that Joe DiMaggio was all mobbed up from early days. And we can talk about
is that a secret? Because I kind of knew that
without knowing it. But yeah, I go into some detail. Oh. So Marilyn chose a mob lawyer, Jerry Geisler, to represent her in the divorce. Yeah. So it was kind of like firing a warning shot over Joe's, bow. But you may recall seeing pictures. There was a press conference, and the most mournful pictures I think I've ever seen of Marilyn were taken that day. She just could not stop crying. She could barely speak a word. She let her lawyer do the talking, standing next to her. She was out in front of the house that she had shared with Joe, and then she was whisked away in a car, in a limo. And it was just pathetic. Joe had come out ahead of time. He could have used an alley to depart from a back door, but he decided to march out the front door, and the press was waiting there, all assembled. And he said he was going home. He meant to San Francisco.
San Francisco, yeah.
And the press said, well, we thought, LA was your home. He said, no, it wasn't. He was very aloof and kind of snooty and drove off with his friend. So that whole day was a disaster for Marilyn. And of course, Joe DiMaggio did not contest her allegations of mental cruelty. And in a nutshell, what was going on is she still had a career. He was at loose ends. He was home rambling around that big house. He complained to her that when she came home late at night, she was just, going back to work. The next morning, he had to study scripts. There was no time for him. So he was boozing it up and watching TV, and he was just at wit's end. And
he wanted a traditional trad wife.
He did.
Yeah.
And when the divorce was filed, it was not officially, legally complete yet. And what did Marilyn do? A few days after the divorce, from the standpoint of the public, was over and done with, she gave Joe a watch for his birthday. Just like she'd given it to Fred Karger, another person we could talk about, who was an early boyfriend of hers as well, who was in show business, and that's a whole other separate story. But she
gave one to somebody else too. We won't say his name, but
yes.
Okay.
So anyway, but Joe continued to. This is the strange thing. I believe Joe DiMaggio truly loved Marilyn. He also proved that by honoring her wishes to deliver roses to her crypt for the next 20 years, a couple of times a week. He was the one that made the funeral arrangements for her. And he did get back in her life after Arthur Miller departed the scene.
Yeah.
Or toward the end of that, and then also during that period. So, however, this notion that they were ever going to remarry, as propagated by a few sensation-seeking hack writers, is totally untrue. And in a coming video, if we have more of these videos,
oh yeah,
I'll certainly go into this and why that's untrue. Because he displayed ill temper, put his hands on Marilyn again in the weeks preceding her death. That also probably is the reason why he was so remorseful at the funeral. He was a devastated man.
Yeah, I remember reading about it. I remember the pictures. I long puzzled over what that draw was. Just two people who loved each other but wanted different things out of life,
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, they had, and I know we're really jumping ahead. I hesitate to do that. But when they kind of got back in each other's lives, it was at arm's length, to the extent that Marilyn was in New York recovering from her gallbladder surgery. And her half-sister, Bernice Miracle, whom we haven't even talked about yet, was called in to kind of stay with her for a little bit during her recovery. So she observed some of this. And Joe, they get together. They would have dinner at Marilyn's house. They weren't drinking alcohol. They were drinking hot tea, which always was kind of amusing to me. In fact, he was drinking hot tea the morning I saw Joe DiMaggio, and he was at that point making TV commercials for Mr. Coffee. But anyway, there are things about people that we don't know. But they had an arrangement where neither one of them, she even described this to Bernice Miracle and also Ralph Roberts, that neither she nor Joe were going to get too attached. And they agreed that they could each date other people if they wanted. However, Marilyn still had to be very circumspect and did not share with Joe all the details of her social life. Meanwhile, by the way, he was dating lookalikes of Marilyn.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yes.
Substitutes. So yeah. I it's been so long now since I've read the book.
Me too, actually. I'm, still trying to remember.
But the story about DiMaggio and Sinatra and the break-in and the threat.
The wrong door raid.
Oh my God.
That might be worth, if you want to talk about that, we can talk about that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think that's this is a good time to talk about it.
In the waning days of the marriage, when Joe and Marilyn were still together, she was involved with the studio, of course, doing a lot of different things. And she had a vocal coach named Hal Schaefer, who had an eye for her. He was kind of a sympathetic guy, but he was a vocal coach that was very good. He played piano. I have a picture of them together in my book. And she was taking instruction from him. She would stand by the piano and he would help her on her phrasing and her breathing and all that. And he became kind of a sympathetic ear, but Joe was just insanely jealous of this gentleman and actually called him up one day and asked him to come over so they could have a man-to-man talk. And when Marilyn learned of this, she was petrified and pleaded with Hal, don't do that. He's going to eat you alive, because Joe was a very big athletic man and Hal Schaefer was a fairly, diminutive man. Hal had some problems. He made a suicide attempt at one point by his own confession.
Now let me see if I've got my memory correct. He was hospitalized with that and she went to visit him?
Yes. And when she did, that really ripped it for Joe.
Yeah.
Excuse me. He was very upset that she would be solicitous of a friend in the hospital, assuming there was more going on between them, which at that point there wasn't. That's the irony. As far as I can tell, they were just close friends, but they grew a little closer as her emotional separation from Joe increased. Anyway, after the divorce, excuse me, Joe got wind of the fact through a detective whom his buddy Frank Sinatra recommended, that Marilyn's Cadillac, which incidentally Jack Benny had given her in lieu of payment for appearing on his TV show a couple of years earlier. Anyway, her Cadillac was seen parked over by the apartment complex where Hal Schaefer lived. So Sinatra stirred this whole thing up. And
did he use, let me interrupt you. Did he use, if I remember, the guy that planted the surveillance stuff, the guy who was like a freelance, somebody else?
No. It was
Tash. That's what I meant. Yeah.
That came later. And I don't think Joe was even necessarily involved with Otash. I have my doubts about that. But anyway, there was a detective that Frank Sinatra had used in the Ava Gardner days. And he was recommending that Joe employ somebody, because even James Haspel would see Joe stalking Marilyn.
Yeah.
He would be hiding in the shadows across from her hotel or wherever she was. And he would be sitting in a hotel lobby with a newspaper held up in front of him and peeking over it when she'd walk through the lobby. He was just a man obsessed.
And didn't he follow her and spy on her at Calneva?
Well, that we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but there was an aspect to that too. But anyway, so one particular night when Joe got wind that Marilyn's car, his ex-wife's car, was parked at Hal Schaefer's apartment, he let Sinatra induce him to go with the recommendation. And they had a group of guys, thugs, basically, that were friends of Sinatra. And they all went over. And Sinatra became genuinely alarmed at how angry Joe was on the way over to this place. They were going to confront them. They had a photographer there and the whole thing. They were going to confront them to embarrass Marilyn, which made no sense because, they were divorced anyway. So what happened was they got their wires crossed. The detective had been wrong. And they broke down the door of this woman. I think she was 32 years old. She was sound asleep. She had curlers in her hair. All of a sudden, she hears glass crashing in her kitchen as they barge in a door, and flash bulbs are popping, and she's blinded. She doesn't even know really who's coming in. Are they molesting her? What are they doing? Attacking her? And then they beat a hasty retreat as soon as they realized that they got the wrong darn door.
Insanity. Yeah.
Now, the irony to this is I report in the book, and I have a minute-by-minute account. People need to buy the book and find that out. But anyway, Marilyn was with Hal Schaefer in the complex. They just got the wrong one.
The wrong apartment.
And talk about ESP. Marilyn had this weird little sensation and was looking out a window, and she realized what was about to happen. So they slipped out, the two of them, Hal and Marilyn, out of a different window.
They literally went out the window, right?
Yeah. And she got in her car and drove off, probably with Hal Schaefer. So they, while the men were entering through a different part of the property, they were making a hasty exit. But the two of them actually were together at that moment. And But anyway, so the woman was baffled. It was reported in the press. This woman's apartment was broken into. Authorities were baffled. They couldn't figure out what had happened. Marilyn didn't know either at that point. Nobody seemed to know except the ones involved. Well, fast forward. The detective never got paid by Joe DiMaggio. I think it was like $600. So he leaked the story months later to Confidential magazine, who headlined it "The Wrong Door Raid." And did they spill the beans on this story?
That's a great story.
And Sinatra was involved. Joe DiMaggio was involved. Joe lied and claimed he knew nothing about it. That broke up Sinatra and Joe's friendship. That was the turning point. Poor old Sinatra, who was really kind of the good Samaritan on this thing, ended up paying
In a way.
well, in a way, and he ended up holding the bag and paying the bills for the judgment, because this woman sued for lots of money. She settled, but it was still, considerable amount of money, and she was entitled to it. She was thoroughly traumatized.
Can you imagine? Oh my God. Yeah.
But anyway, it was in Confidential magazine, and Joe escaped that and forevermore claimed that he knew nothing about this raid. But why on earth would Sinatra care at that point? Sinatra was the swinger of the age. And, even when he was dating her, he was dating other people. And
just a little side story.
Mm-hmm.
Frank Sinatra, really? I mean, I just don't get it. The swinger of the age. Why was he? I don't see it.
He could sing. He could sing love songs, right?
Yeah, but
he appealed to the Bobby Soxers, and I've actually released. I'm also a music producer, and I've released albums of tracks by Sinatra, some of which we overdubbed, and some of which we did in another way. But anyway, I can't figure out his appeal, like during the Bobby Sox days, to young, like teenagers, like almost like Elvis, because the songs he was singing were not, it was pre-rock and roll. But anyway, give him his due. He was a very popular singer.
But to me, and this is just a personal observation, I don't care how talented you are. When you're that much of a D, it just emanates from your pores. Don't people feel that? I mean, I would want nothing to do with the person.
Dorothy
arrogant.
Kilgallen, as Sarah writes in her book, The Incredible Life and Mysterious Death of Dorothy
She hated
Kilgallen.
him.
Yeah. Well, they got along originally until Dorothy started reporting about his mob ties. She was overall quite complimentary, which is strange, and even continued to write complimentary things.
Well, let me rephrase that. He hated her because he had a fragile ego.
Yes. Yeah. And yet, to give him some credit also, he was also a very compassionate guy. He'd pick up the hospital bills for people that couldn't afford. He was a real, once you were a friend of his, he was a true blue friend and was loyal to you. He didn't betray friends. Apparently, we can't say the same thing about Joe DiMaggio. So anyway, probably good riddance, but I'm glad that Marilyn later in life did have moments when Joe was the shoulder to lean on, and he indeed was. And we can go through that at another time.
Such a conflicted relationship.
Yeah.
And eventually, we won't forget. I want to get back to this whole, excuse me, her sensing, looking out the window. I think there's a story there we need to talk about. But let's continue on this saga of her really broken picker when it came to husbands.
Well, Arthur Miller. She had met him 2 years before she actually ended up marrying him. And Arthur Miller is a guy that, strangely enough, she probably had the most stable relationship with, certainly the longest term marriage that she had. She ended up divorcing him on the very day of the presidential inaugural in 1961.
Yeah.
Wonder why that was.
Yeah.
But anyway, Arthur Miller was a real ass. I hope you don't mind my saying that. I'm actually being polite to say that. But Arthur Miller.
Well, he was a psychopath, in my professional opinion.
Well, she met him at a time when he was married and had children. She didn't want to break up a home. In fact, she begged him not to do that. But he was sloppy, and his wife found out about it and kicked him out of the house. And he ended up staying in a hotel. But anyway, Marilyn was attracted to the intellectual side.
Yeah.
She had already experienced the big, brawny jock, that being Joe DiMaggio. And here was the other side. Arthur Miller was also tall, not a particularly adept athlete, certainly not a professional athlete, but he was a big guy who bore, in some ways, with his long face and cheeks, a remarkable resemblance to Abraham Lincoln. You need to bring me back to that topic. But anyway, without his glasses on, he
Yeah.
kind of had that long face.
Yeah,
Tall,
you're right.
like
You're
Lincoln.
right.
But Arthur Miller, this is what I was getting at. She was captivated by his intellect, and they did exchange letters back and forth. They ended up, I think it was Kazan who introduced them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and they met clandestinely and so forth. But he did a really remarkable thing that's not very admirable, and that is that he didn't bother to ask Marilyn to marry him. What he did instead is he announced it on national television. While he was on the hot seat testifying in front of Congress, he was found in contempt of Congress during the Red Scare days of Joe McCarthy for refusing to disclose the nature of his relationship with some suspected communists. And he was held in contempt of Congress. Now, I'm not saying that wasn't an admirable,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he wouldn't name names. Yeah.
But what he did was to squeeze out of that and enhance his own stature, was to announce that in mere days, I am going to wed Miss Marilyn Monroe. And Marilyn Monroe knew nothing about it. He even mentioned it, but this is on live TV. And she's saying, and she's real upset about this, and said to, I think, Amy Green, well, it's very nice of him to let me in on that, and tell me about that. So that didn't go over very well at all. Then of the tragic circumstances surrounding the official press conference when they were announcing their engagement.
Unbelievable. Why don't you tell that story? Because that's just unbelievable.
Well, James Haskell was part of that too. He was actually invited. There was going to be a press conference up in Connecticut. Arthur Miller had owned a farm. It wasn't really used for farming. He wasn't raising crops. He did lease part of that out. But it was in a rural setting, a big old farmhouse. And there was going to be a press conference to announce that Marilyn and Arthur were going to be married. And on the day of, a reporter, a foreign reporter who was in this country, a woman, linked up with a photographer, a man, and they were trying to get the jump on the rest of the press who were all assembled at Arthur's farm. And they spotted Marilyn and Arthur in a car driven by a family member of his going down the road. And they thought, well, we're going to follow that car. We're going to get an exclusive, find out where they're going, because this was ahead of the press conference. And the car was going at a high rate of speed. Unfortunately, it invokes similarities to what happened to Princess Diana.
And I hadn't even thought about that, but you're absolutely right. Yeah.
They were speeding on rural roads that were not good in those days. And there was a hairpin turn. And the reporter, the photographer who had the female passenger reporter with him, missed the turn. He was approaching at too high of a speed and he crashed into a tree.
Yeah.
She was propelled, this was before seatbelts.
Yeah.
She was propelled through
the
windshield. Very grisly, tragic accident. And they heard it. So Marilyn and Arthur and their driver stopped right away and ran back to the scene.
Ugh.
Marilyn and Arthur and his relative helped remove the woman from the hood of the car and put her down as gently as they could by the roadside. The driver of the car was still disoriented and not able to be of any use. And I have in my book actually a picture. They then jumped in the car and proceeded to Arthur's house so they could call an ambulance. I hope I can show that picture. There is Marilyn running. Now there's the press. There was a lot more press than are visible there.
At the house, yeah.
At the house, waiting for the press conference. But Marilyn, who you can't tell, but she has blood-stained clothes. She's wearing her high heels. She is running, ignoring the reporters, running up to the house so that they can call an ambulance. When Arthur gets on the phone to call the ambulance, they're told that it could be an hour and a half or what have you.
Oh my God.
Before an ambulance could get there. And he said, well, it damn well better not, because that was Marilyn Monroe back there on the road. He lied a little bit. I defend that white lie. I think that was the right thing to do. So he wanted to make sure they got out there. They were
Right.
somebody out there. In the meantime, they got blankets. James Haspel, who had been invited, as he often was to things like this, had hitched a ride out there. And the relative, and we're still confused whether it was Arthur's brother or his cousin, but there was a relative there that he gave Haspel some blankets to go back down to the accident scene because they all heard the accident. It was so terrible. And he drove him down there. And when they got there, the press was already assembling. In fact, you can go on YouTube and you can see newsreel footage of the aftermath of the crash. You can even
I watched it. Yeah.
And you can see James Haspel there.
Yeah.
And you can identify him by, at one point, he's sitting on the ground. And he takes this rag and he throws it down with all of his might. He's so disgusted because this wolf pack of photographers are snapping away and no one is rendering any assistance. And he was the one that had to pull the sheet over her, not over her face. When Haspel related this story to me on 2 occasions, he broke down and he didn't just cry, he sobbed. It still emotionally impacted him.
Oh, it's a trauma.
Yeah. So consider the context. There was still to be this press conference with worldwide media, a bunch of people.
Which is mind-blowing. You can watch it. It's mind-blowing. Yeah.
So what happened is, in the meantime, when they get back up to the house, the farm, Marilyn has changed clothes, as has Arthur. One of Arthur's first comments, they kind of met the press under a tree. And you can see film of this, part of it. And he said, well, I was afraid something like this was going to happen. He was disgusted by how the press had always hounded them and so forth. And then he kind of stammered and stuttered. And Haspel remarked on that was the day he saw what a pro Marilyn really was, because she kind of covered her mouth and whispered to her husband to be and told him basically, let me handle this. And so Arthur remained silent. And then with her great composure, after just having witnessed this trauma,
unbelievable. Yeah.
Marilyn answered the press's questions and spoke in a very demure and professional and subdued fashion. Ultimately, then they snuck off and got married. Then with the justice of the peace.
Oh, and those pictures are something else after.
What happened, the pictures you're relating probably are from the formal Jewish ceremony. Amy and Milton Green were Jewish, and well, he was anyway. And they were there for the official Jewish ceremony that was also accommodated by Arthur's lawyer, who helped him set that up in a manner that only invited guests would be there and nobody'd find out about it beyond that. But Marilyn got cold feet. Keep in mind, she'd already gone through the official justice of the peace marriage, but she felt like, and maybe was encouraged to believe, that if she didn't go through with the Jewish ceremony, that it wouldn't take, it could be annulled more easily.
Well, his family probably wouldn't regard it as official. Yeah.
Well, that's true. But anyway, so she and Amy and Milton Green had a serious conversation at the 11th hour while the guests were all assembled downstairs at this house of her aborting it. And they assured her, we'll take care of it. We'll handle this. We'll get you in a car, get you out of here.
Yeah, get out of here.
Deal with the guests, and don't worry about it. Just say the word. And she said, I don't want to get married. I don't want to go through with it. So that's the plan that they were going to implement. Then she thought better of it and said, well, we can't disappoint all these people. So Marilyn went through with the marriage. Throughout her life, if you haven't noticed, she was a people pleaser.
Yeah.
And that was the wrong time to be that people pleaser. If you look at some of the photographs, these were taken like 3 days after the accident. They don't look like the happy couple.
Oh,
they're just not, there's a picture or two where they're smiling, but the rest of the time.
There's so much space between them,
And he's puffing on a cigarette, walking off in the distance. She's trying to get his attention, that kind of thing.
It's the epitome
It would have been better
arrogance.
off. She would have been better off if she hadn't.
Pardon?
She would have been a lot better off if she had not married Arthur Miller.
Yeah.
He did contribute some stability to her life, but then shortly thereafter she had formed and I know this is really hideously out of sequence, but they went overseas for her to film The Prince and the Showgirl that we addressed a little bit in the first video.
Yeah.
And right after they got there, Arthur did something just unforgivable. He wrote bad things about his new bride in his diary and left the page open on a table where Marilyn was sure to come through the room and see that.
What a mistake.
Like,
right?
oh yeah, it was just accidental. And of course it wounded her deeply.
Yeah.
And she actually, in telling that story, said that it upset her so much that she was on a shooting schedule. Marilyn Monroe Productions was producing this, so additional money of hers was on the line. And she had this hellish schedule. She was in most of the scenes in this movie. The British press was hounding her and criticizing her. Why aren't you attending this event? Why aren't you going to this play? Well, she didn't have time, you know. But anyway, she told friends that she started having to take some sleeping medication just to get some shut eye so that she could go ahead and film this movie and look attractive and, you know, perform in front of the camera. And she kind of attributed that to Arthur. Fast forward, he did this another couple of times later on. You know, the latter part
specifically, he did what?
He left
unflattering
a diary open, knowing she would see it. He'd leave it on the same table where there was a script revision she knew she had to look at. Gosh, you know, what a surprise. She accidentally saw that. And he even did something kind of comparable at the farm after they were divorced, when she went up there in a trip on 3 occasions with Ralph Roberts towing a trailer behind his station wagon to not only remove some items of Arthur's that were still in Marilyn's apartment, which she owned in New York, and give them back to Arthur, and also then vice versa, get some of her things from the farm, you know, in Connecticut, and bring them back home. But he even did it then too. So this guy was a psychological terrorist.
Oh, he was a piece of work. He was a horrible person.
Then he ended up, after she died, writing this horrible play, which I will fast forward enough to tell you on that score, in case I forget, that Arthur Miller was invited to the Kennedy assassination, which is a little strange for reasons you can only surmise.
Oh, inauguration.
In 61, very cold day. But then he also became friends with Jackie Kennedy, was part of her circle for a while. But when Arthur Miller came out with that play, which depicted Marilyn in a very crude way, unflattering way, called After the Fall, I think is the name of it.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Jackie Kennedy cut him off. She was so offended by his portrayal. To Jackie Kennedy, loyalty was paramount in all of her friends and her relationships. And if you ever betrayed that loyalty, you were persona non grata. So after having been seated at her table at some social event or function that she had held, when that play came out and everybody drew parallels between Marilyn and that play, that script, that was the end for Jackie Kennedy. She wanted nothing more to do with Arthur Miller. And this is the guy that, by the way, he had 2 children that Marilyn was very good to and very close to and loved dearly, like she loved Joe Jr.
Yeah, she was remarkably good as a stepmother, you know. Yeah.
And Arthur, for parenting purposes, Arthur Miller had a child that he never acknowledged, who doesn't even appear, he never publicly acknowledged, doesn't even appear in the obituaries, because this was a child with a mental handicap.
Oh, you got cut out.
That's the kind of guy he was. He was a child. So despite his literary prowess and, you know, the plays he wrote, which, by the way, even one of his plays was inspired by his first wife, who, you know, spent money keeping him afloat as he was pursuing a writing career, just like Marilyn kept him afloat, even paying his alimony for him.
Yeah, she paid his alimony to his former wife. He was a piece of work.
Yet when they divorced, she did not ask for it. She gave him the farm back, even though she invested heavily, both financially and physically, in upgrading, even building writer's cottage for the guy on the farm. She was not small enough to demand, recompense for all the money that she shelled out for Arthur. So basically, that's a summary of these three guys. The only other little postscript I'd give to Jim Doherty is kind of a melancholy one, and that is that when Bernice Miracle came to visit her sister Marilyn after the gallbladder surgery in '61, she of course Bernice had met Joe DiMaggio because Marilyn was resuming seeing him at that time. She also met Arthur Miller when she accompanied Marilyn and Ralph Roberts up to Connecticut to retrieve some furniture. And one night they got to talking, and Marilyn asked, well, which one of these guys do you like the best? And wanting to be diplomatic, Bernice didn't really want to. Well, she liked both of them for their qualities. And then in a reflective, quiet way, Marilyn said, I wish you'd gotten to meet Jimmy. Remember how I used to tell you about him? So even this many years later, there was a spot in Marilyn's heart for James Doherty. I don't know if he ever knew that or not, but it was there, as witnessed by her half-sister.
Well, she struck me as a very loyal person.
Yeah.
I laughed at about halfway through covering the book. It kind of became a trope. She would meet peripheral people, and they remained her friends until the day she died. I mean, it was just hilarious at some point. Significant. You don't see that.
Well, let's pick up on this Fred Karger thing that I was telling you about earlier.
Oh, right.
That was preceding Joe DiMaggio and all that. She fell in love with a guy named Fred Karger, who was quite a handsome guy. He had been divorced. He lived with his mother and his daughter and a sister. Mary Karger was also part of this. Ann Karger was the mother. And Marilyn was welcomed into their family for a period of months and spent a lot of time with them. Officially didn't live with them. She had a little apartment also, but she was around a lot. She was like a member of the family. And then Marilyn allegedly told some little innocuous white lie. And Fred seized upon that and used that as an excuse for not marrying her. He ended up marrying Jane Wyman instead.
Oh.
And Marilyn did crash the wedding reception in a cute way that I go into in the book. I'm going to save that one for the book. They're going to have to buy the book to know that story.
That's a good
But anyway, what was interesting about this is, and picking up on the fact that you said that Marilyn stayed friends, she continued to stay friends with Fred's sister and her mother and his mother the rest of her life.
Yeah.
In fact, if you believe the story, which I don't totally believe, Marilyn talked to them on Friday before she died. And according to a book that came out that I don't want to promote because it was ghost written, there's some embellishment for sure there. And one of the embellishment points was Marilyn had supposedly confided that she and the AG were going to get married. And I think that's just ridiculous.
I don't think she had any
Not
intention.
at all. She had no desire for that at all.
No.
So that's what made me think. The other parts of the book were very relevant. For example, there was a film that had been shown around that showed Marilyn sitting around in a living room with some people. There was a couple of military guys there. It was actually the Karger home, as I understand it. And she took a couple of puffs on a cigarette that was passed around. People said, aha, she was smoking a joint. Well, Mary Karger, who wrote the book, said, no, 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 no. And do you seriously think these military guys that were there in uniform, by the way, were going to risk going back to the base reeking of marijuana? And no, Marilyn wasn't. And the way she was holding the cigarette is the same way my Uncle Carl held a cigarette. Some people didn't hold it the way you would normally hold a cigarette in your hands.
They hold it like this.
Hold it like this.
Oh yeah, I saw people smoke like that.
And I always found that odd about my Uncle Carl, and he was not smoking marijuana, I guarantee you. So
you know what that comes from? That comes from. I mean, and I remember I'm that old. Often women, especially, but people who were concerned about yellowing hair or teeth from the smoke, they would use an extension, a cigarette holder, and they would hold it like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you see it made fun of, kind of. It's a stereotype you see like in cartoons and old movies.
Well, she
It was
was
a real thing.
She didn't have, I'm not referring, however, to a cigarette holder.
No, I know you're not. I know.
But just holding the underside of it. And, you know, I have been in the presence of, and not participated, people smoking a joint and held it in a variety of different ways. And, you know, so that film was a home movie, and she debunked that, and Marilyn was not a druggie. In fact, I can't recall any anecdote where Marilyn was ever connected with illicit drugs, ever. People have alleged that maybe she was taking too many sleeping pills or what have you, but she was not, you know, using illicit drugs.
Well, she was remarkably beautiful, and she emanated good health. She didn't look dissipated. She didn't look like, if you spend any time with people who do chemicals, it affects your skin quality and tone. It affects your luster in your hair. Your eyes show it. You don't have to be wasted at the moment to show the side effects.
Right.
You can spot it. People are negatively affected by the use of substances that are not, you know, okay.
And they likely would not confine their usage just to their leisure moments behind the scene. When you were under pressure, I would think that would be a time, if you were indulging in that pastime of marijuana use, to be off somewhere puffing a joint or whatever before filming a scene or posing for a still photographer.
Right.
I'm waiting for somebody to show me a picture of Marilyn with bloodshot eyes.
No. And you don't work with the work ethic that she had, with from early in the day until late at night, classes, rehearsals, more classes, and then.
By the way, it would make you tired. Doesn't it normally make you tired? So why in the world would the woman ever have trouble sleeping?
You wouldn't have that kind of work ethic and be able to maintain it.
Or hunger.
Yeah.
What people eat, that's notoriously raiding the refrigerator or whatever. And this is not a woman that put on pounds. Although, just as an aside, the press was reporting at the time when they were beating up on her in June of 62 that she had gained weight. I had a quote here somewhere I was going to read to you. That, you know, she had gained a lot of weight. She was basically unrecognizable. She was blah, blah, blah. And of course, you know that's a lie. Look at all those pictures of her.
Look at the pictures.
Full side. And her figure was just outstanding.
It blew my mind to read that, because I kept looking at the pictures and looking at the dates and going, where? I don't, bizarre.
Anyway, but I think we pretty well, the Fred Karger thing, and by the way, she gave him a very expensive watch that was engraved with a lovely message, a loving message on the back side of it, but she didn't put her name Marilyn on it because she said, I imagine you're going to be wanting to wear that watch. And, you know, I don't want some woman to know who it was that you were involved with.
Yeah.
But I think Jane Wyman probably did figure that one out at some point.
Well, her judgment didn't prove to be all that good later in life, did it? So who else did we wanted to?
Well, actually, you could argue that Jane had a good idea at the very end of that one marriage you're referring to, because she got rid of the guy.
Yeah. You don't want to get me on that subject because I grew up in Southern California. So put two and two together.
Well, then I won't be sending you my next book.
What are you doing? I think
I'm actually doing a political book that I gave a copy of the manuscript to Bill Clinton. I had it's a long story I won't go into at the moment, but anyway, I wanted him to react to this book. I will tell you it's on Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
And anyway, and he took it to heart. He took the manuscript and took it home. He and I had met for about 35 minutes. And I had a connection with the president and the first family, even the fax number of the White House, et cetera. It's a long story. My daughter Sarah has been with Chelsea Clinton and Hillary behind the scenes and so forth. But anyway, I had given this to Bill Clinton, and then he subsequently wrote a letter praising it, saying, you know, it's very impressive. I'm glad I had the opportunity to read it. I agree with much of it, as you may guess, and don't think I won't be using that as a promotion, to have
nice, nice
anyway,
blurb in the cover.
anyway, I couldn't resist that little teaser. Anybody that would have that inclination, that book will be out this spring.
So,
and don't worry, it's not 768 pages.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Nor do I expect you to be covering
much
it
about
either.
Ronald Reagan. I'm sorry. He's my nemesis, my bête noire. So we talked about her bad marriages, and you let me know when you've had enough. I mean, as far as time goes, because I'll just go on indefinitely. So I thought it was interesting to juxtapose her marriages, maybe not counting the first one, with her other relationships with men. And I'm thinking specifically people like Milton Green. And she seemed to have good relationships with men when she was in a position of some sort of control. But when it came to love relationships, it seemed like she lost that. It was weird, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got Carter, like you mentioned, mm-hmm. Hyde, who was the guy that was the family man, and then you have Rosenfield, who kept coming back into her life, the man who was the clothes manufacturer. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about him. Yeah, definitely.
And they all helped her. And she was in a position with all of them, it seems to me, that if she wanted to take advantage of their money, they all probably would have married her, maybe. Maybe Carter fell off of that. But the other two, Hyde really wanted to marry her, didn't he?
Oh, he definitely did.
Yeah.
She did spend a lot of time at his home and kind of helped redecorate it a little bit. He accommodated her tastes. He did help in the sense of introducing her to art and that sort of thing before Arthur Miller ever came on the scene.
A little bit like a Pygmalion.
Yeah, yeah. And but toward the end, she was kind of, I don't want to say abandoning him, but moving on a bit. One of her first acting coaches, which we need to remember to talk about, Natasha Lightis, scolded her for not going to see Johnny because he was having chest pains and cardiac symptoms and that kind of thing. He knew he was not soon for the world, and he urged Marilyn to marry him because he said that she would become a very wealthy woman.
She would inherit, and she wouldn't do it. Yeah.
And she would not do it. So what does that say about her character?
That's right. And I think that when people say she was a gold digger and she was using men, I never saw that. I didn't get that impression whatsoever. We won't even talk about that particular family from the East Coast, the two brothers. We'll get to that, but that's that's such a mess. Right. But for example, her relationship with Sinatra confused me.
Mm-hmm. He had wanted to date her early on, she told Ralph Roberts, and she had declined. And then after she became available again following her divorce from Arthur Miller, which, as I said, occurred on January 21st, 1961, concurrent with the inauguration. Mm-hmm. Men came out of the woodwork, not just Sinatra or any other guy, but a bunch of them. And he had wanted to have her take a train trip. Sinatra was a real rail buff. He collected model trains. He had an elaborate, probably $1 million train collection in Palm Springs and so forth. And he would put on the conductor's hat and the whole thing. Guys,
my uncle and my husband's uncle did the same thing.
Well, it's a serious hobby. And when I was a teenager, I was into that too. In fact, I am a rail buff. I don't have any collection of model trains, but I like steam engines, and I have coffee table books that show the grand era of rail travel. I wish we would return to some of that.
Have you ever been to the train museum in Sacramento?
No.
Oh, well, there you go. You're welcome.
I know, but I love all that, and I can understand Frank's affinity for that. But he had contacted in the aftermath of the Arthur Miller end of that marriage and proposed that Marilyn fly out to California from New York and board a train with him and go cross country on like a sightseeing trip. Mm-hmm. And she debated it, but she told Ralph Roberts she didn't think she would go along with it, and she didn't, because she said, what if we end up not liking each other?
Yeah, you're
Then they'd be
stuck.
stuck on this, thousands of miles across the country. So take note that Marilyn was not dating Frank Sinatra until a little later in that scenario. She was not dating him years earlier. I'm sure their paths crossed. Celebrities would bump into other celebrities. Doesn't mean they knew them personally. Might say, nod at them or say hello. But anyway, but then ultimately she did yield to that. And people keep saying, and I got to be careful how I report this. People keep saying that it was Sinatra who acted as a procurer for his highly placed government friend.
Oh,
That
yeah.
may have been true of other women. It was not true of Marilyn, who met that individual, that elite politician, on her own years before.
Previously, yeah.
And it wasn't Peter Lawford that did that either, but you commonly find that refrain in all these hokey books that are released on Marilyn. I'm still trying to find one that I like other than the one I wrote. But anyway.
Oh, I like your book. I think it's great.
That sounds very egotistical, but it's honestly,
no, I think
it's
methodology
behind mine, I understand. But anyway,
I think it's incredibly fair and thorough. It's really thorough. So
I talk about how Sinatra could also be, and Kitty Kelly had a great book on him that he tried to stop publication of, on Sinatra.
Is that a good book? Is that worth reading?
I felt it was, yeah. Very thoroughly researched. Very thick book.
Yeah. Well, you don't think that would stop me, do you?
Well, Sinatra, no, I don't. Sinatra was quite abusive verbally with friends, particularly when he was drinking. And he was even nasty to Pat Lawford one night when he wanted her and another gal to continue partying. And it was like already 2 or 3 in the morning. They had it for the night. So he could be abusive, and he was abusive.
Was that Betty Grable? No, he even admitted he badmouthed her. I mean, the things he said about her.
Are you talking about Marilyn?
No, Pat Lawford.
Yeah.
I won't repeat what he said.
He had quite an interesting relationship with her.
Awful.
To get what he wanted out of her.
Did you ever see Phil Hartman do Sinatra on Saturday Night Live?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I have.
That is I think that's the quintessential. Yeah. He really got to the core of the person. Just nasty.
I will say, in having done music production and dealing with Sinatra tracks, I have grown in my appreciation of him as a vocalist. That doesn't comment on him as a human being, but as a vocalist. I think he was a very skilled singer, one of the great singers of the American Songbook. But anyway, bottom line is, the Sinatra thing was kind of odd. He did escort her to some parties. He also defended her when it counted. When the press was really on her and dumping all over her, Sinatra had been away. He had actually been on a tour suggested by Marilyn's attorney, Mickey Grudem. He went on a goodwill tour that he paid for to go to impoverished areas and do free shows and bring world attention to childhood hunger. It's quite an expansive thing. He brought his musicians along, chartered a big jet for this. It wasn't his usual plane that he used. And when Sinatra came back, he held a press conference, and I reported in the book. It's very unusual because normally he was antagonistic toward the press. But he wanted to make a point at this press conference, and he brought up the cessation of filming of the aborted movie that Marilyn was making with Dean Martin. And he volunteered the comment. He had seen the script, and he thought that Marilyn and Dean were the scapegoats for the big shots at the studio. He was absolutely correct. And that they did a service by saving the public this dreadful movie, and it would have been a dreadful movie. So he also, by the way, had dinner right away when he came back into town with Marilyn from his trip that summer of '62. They met. I can tell you the date and everything. It's in the book. And they talked about 2 film projects. They were going to appear in 2 movies together.
Yeah.
One of which would be called I Love Louisa. One of the premises of one of the films was Marilyn was going to play a character whose husbands kept dying, like she was a jinx or something, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Comedy. And he thought the chemistry, and in fact, Sinatra even commented on this at his press conference. He thought the chemistry people would enjoy between him and Marilyn. And I think that was probably true.
That I don't know. I don't find him appealing. I don't deny that he was a great singer, but I always preferred Dean Martin. So I fell for the charm. And Dean Martin, you know, he had an interesting background. He is also Italian,
Mhm.
and he described early on in his career having to change his name because the prejudice against Italians in this country was so bad that they were treated as, and this is his words, not mine, they were treated as not white. They were considered,
Yes.
it's just very puzzling to me. But anyway.
And of course, between the two of them, Dean Martin, to my knowledge, never dated Marilyn.
No, they were friends,
Yeah,
and he
and he was-
defended her. He quit in protest when she
Yeah.
was
Oh, absolutely.
suspended
He
by
sure
the
did.
studio.
They thought they could get by and replace Marilyn, or at least
Yeah.
some of the board members did. You know, the ones that were affiliated with the family that I spoke to.
Yeah. What a man!
We see how that turned out, didn't we?
Oh, what a nut! Oh,
With
ridiculous.
Daryl Zanuck coming to the rescue and regaining control and all that stuff. But anyway, that's the thing on Sinatra. But
Let's see here. I
what
got
was
my
the other guy you were talking? You mentioned another name. I'd forgotten.
Rosenfield.
No, not him. He was a dress manufacturer and a multimillionaire.
Yeah, Hyde. We talked about
No,
him.
one of the first ones that you mentioned.
Oh, Milton Green.
Milton Green. That's an interesting relationship.
Yeah.
Milton Green's son has written about his dad meeting Marilyn in such and such a year. Amy Green, whom I think is still alive, may have said the same thing. But I can tell you for a fact that based on correspondence that I have a copy of, that Marilyn and Milton met years earlier. I believe it was around 1949.
Now, did Dr. Greenson introduce them, or did he?
No.
No, that was the attorney.
She didn't even know him until 1960 or so.
So how did she meet?
Go ahead.
How'd she meet Green?
She somewhere ran across him, and she spent time with him. He was between wives. Amy was not his first wife, and she spent time. Marilyn did in his. He also lived out in Connecticut, and kind of away from the New York scene, but yet close enough you could get into New York when you needed to. And Milton was a fabulous photographer. In fact, I think he took some of the best pictures anybody's ever taken, other than Richard Avedon and some of those. But anyway, I have, and I reproduce it in my book, you have to look that up, where I quote what Marilyn wrote Milton. She was thanking him for his hospitality. And she wrote it as a poem in rhyme. And the date on it establishes that they had gotten together back around 1949, several years before it's been otherwise acknowledged. But when Marilyn fled Hollywood after being upset with the scripts, throwing one of them back with the word trash on it because they kept wanting her to play the blonde bimbo roles, and she
wanted to break away from that.
And we'll have to separate this out maybe at some point and talk about her, getting assimilated by the actor studio. But anyway, Marilyn and Milton Green linked up at exactly the right time, and they formed Marilyn Monroe Productions. Right. She had 51% of the stock, 49%. And give Milton credit because he did execute some shrewd business plans and some really good business deals. What broke them up, to fast forward, was when Arthur Miller came on the scene.
That's right.
And was jealous of the closeness between Milton and Marilyn. And I'm not alleging there was any kind of romantic relationship, although I also don't rule that out based on some things that were said that Sammy Davis Jr. even alluded to that I quote in my book. But
Miller, to me, it strikes me that Miller, I don't remember all the examples that I kind of filed away in my brain, but there were a number of different relationships in her life that he put an end to. Oh, yeah. I think he was isolating her. That's abuse.
Absolutely. He was like that. And but he's the one that kept writing. He was doing a psychological game on Marilyn, blaming her business partner for things that were really nobody's fault.
It was very sad.
Exaggerating. And what Milton Green would do is Arthur Miller would scream at him on the phone. And Milton told him that, if you keep this up, I'm going to hang up. And he kept it up, so he'd hang up on him. And then Arthur, I reproduce quotes from one letter where Arthur has written Marilyn and said, Milton's trying to divide us. He's trying to, sabotage your career. He just doesn't understand us. And he presented himself as being the one that was the guiding light for her career, as if he knew anything about film. As a matter of fact, we can also say about Arthur Miller, maybe on another occasion, that he really screwed up the scripts that he helped on. Marilyn blamed him and said one of them was the worst thing. In fact, Let's Make Love, that film, it had no role. She said it was her worst role. And Arthur Miller touched that as he did The Misfits and other things. So he was just bad news.
Yeah, he really was a reprehensible human being. I don't know why she put up with him as long as she did. So let's talk about these doctors. Oh my God, where did they get their professional ethics? And what a bunch of nefarious criminal types. It's unbelievable. She didn't have a single doctor really that treated her with respect and honored her privacy. And it's just unbelievable.
Well, one begat another, which begat another. I think Marianne Chris, the one in New York who had hospitalized her in the lockup ward with a private cell in which she was stripped naked, carried face down, such a degrading treatment for a woman who, by the way, just a couple of days earlier was in public, functioning well. Ralph Roberts had seen her. She had spent the weekend with Joe DiMaggio. They would have been sounding the alarm if there was anything amiss about Marilyn. And the next thing you know, she's in this hospital. And Marilyn was duped into this by Marianne Chris. Interestingly enough, right after Marilyn was coerced into signing a will. Now, the pretense for doing the will at that time was, okay, she was rid of Arthur Miller, so it would make sense to revise the will and, get rid of Arthur Miller. So I understand that part. But her Aaron Frosch, her attorney for for New York representation, drew up the will. It was highly suspicious. It was ultimately challenged unsuccessfully later on. And Marianne Chris and the Strasbergs end up in that will in a big, big way. And Marianne Chris hospitalizes Marilyn right after that will is signed. And on the day Marilyn signed it, there's unaccounted hours, including a trip out of state, that were charged to Marilyn for her on two different trips. And normally you would have a third party witness the will signing. In this case, Aaron Frosch just had his secretary witness it. And Marilyn complained about that will, why she didn't get around to changing it. She even talked about changing it on the Monday.
Well, I was going to say she had an appointment, didn't she, to go update
on that Monday that she was dead by
before she died. Yeah.
But anyway, Marianne Chris is the one that when Marilyn got rid of that woman, and Ralph Roberts talked about he picked up Marilyn from the hospital. She was actually rescued by Joe DiMaggio. That came to her aid when she was locked up. She managed to reach him, and he flew up from Florida and threatened to disassemble the hospital if she was not, brick by brick, if she was not released.
Well, that's an incredible story because apparently everything was taken away from her and she was kept in isolation. And somehow, she found a nickel or a dime and was able to make a phone call.
Yes, a dime would work in a pay phone. And her heart pounding, she said. She ran down the hall and made a quick phone call, no doubt collect, to Joe, managed to reach him in Florida. But even before that, let's make note that she had managed through a friendly nurse to smuggle out a note to the Strasbergs, and they never lifted a finger to help her. And they later defended themselves and say, well, what could we do? Well, they could have called Joe DiMaggio, who was unaware that she was in a hospital. At one point, it did leak out. It did end up in the press at one point. But when Marilyn managed to reach Joe, it had not yet been publicized. And Joe did make a hasty trip up to New York and threatened the hospital, and they did release her. She went home, and then, still feeling that she needed to have some therapy, she agreed to go to a Presbyterian facility, and she spent a little bit of time there. Ralph Roberts was there also, and to visit her. And when she got out, then she ended up attending the funeral for Arthur Miller's mother, who had passed away, because she was close to both of his parents. And May Reese, a secretary she inherited from Arthur Miller, who ended up being a very good woman, by the way. May Reese is shown in a picture in my book. Show the book. May Reese is accompanying her as the two women dressed in black are going to attend
the funeral. Yeah.
Of Arthur Miller's mother.
It's just a litany of abusers and users and psychopaths and narcissists and just.
Well, I kind of got us off the track. I apologize. I wanted just to establish that the person that she linked up with got her linked up, I believe, in California, was Marianne Chris.
Yeah. And she is the one who ultimately ended up inheriting things in her will.
Incidentally, you do. This will have an oblique reference that some won't pick up on. Others will. I think it'll pass the Helen test. But Ralph Roberts related that after she got rid of Marianne Chris, well, first of all, when he picked her up at the hospital, Marianne Chris was in the car with her. And Marilyn unleashed a fury that so reduced Marianne Chris to just trembling that after Ralph Roberts dropped Marilyn off at her apartment, he proceeded to drive Marianne Chris home. And she kept saying, I did a terrible thing. I did a terrible thing. I did a terrible thing. And indeed, Marilyn thought so. Yet somehow or another, Marianne Chris gets her linked up with Ralph Greenson out in LA. Who would figure that out? But I was going to tell you, just as a quick aside, before figuring that out, and Marilyn decided to go to California because she couldn't find a therapist she liked in New York after Marianne Chris. But she did have an appointment at one building that Ralph Roberts walked with her to. Don't forget, Marilyn did a lot of walking, as a lot of New Yorkers did, but she especially did to keep in good shape.
Right.
And as they approached this building, they saw the name on the building read, The White House. It's in New York. It's a building called the White House. And Marilyn had an appointment at the White House for her therapy. And I'll just leave that dangle out there. People can make what they will of that.
Well,
anyway.
How are you doing for time? Because I have one topic that I don't want to neglect. We could pick it up at a later time if you're tired, or we could talk about it now. It's up to you. But I had hinted at it off camera that I really want to pick up this thread of her being prescient, of her having this obsession with Lincoln and the odd connection, parallels in the lives of Lincoln and Kennedy. Mm-hmm. That trope. Are you familiar with that thing?
Oh yeah. Well,
yeah.
Kennedy had a secretary whose name was Lincoln.
Yeah.
Lincoln had a secretary, one of them that was named Kennedy.
Yeah.
One elected in 1860, the other elected in 1960.
Right. Kennedy shot in a Ford, Lincoln killed in the Ford Theater. It just goes on and on.
It's I know.
Bizarre.
It's very weird.
Yeah, it's very weird.
Well, I do believe that, Ralph Roberts affirmed that when he would be giving Marilyn massages, which is his principal role in her life, although he did so many other things, he would go shopping with her. He was just her shoulder to lean on. He's
one of the heroes. That and her makeup guy, White.
There's nobody that you could name that was about. In fact, even Pat Newcomb, the publicist, said that Ralph Roberts was the best friend Marilyn ever had. I think that was true. But he said that when he was giving her massages, they wouldn't be talking about anything, she was relaxing. all of a sudden she'd pop up with something and said, you know, what do you think is such and such? And it was the same topic he was talking
about,
or
yeah,
vice versa.
thinking
She would be laying there, you know, half asleep, and he'd say, yeah, I was just finishing reading a new book by Willa Cather, which is one of the things. And Marilyn said, oh my gosh, you know, and they had both been doing it, and neither knew that the other was doing that. So they repeatedly explored this whole idea. Not to get us way off track, but Dorothy Kilgallen did that also in trying to guess the mystery guest.
That's not off track.
I'm going to leave that for Sarah. But anyway, there is this. It is kind of odd, though, that these two women who died under similar circumstances both had this ESP thing that they followed, you know, and believed in it and trusted it instinctively. But often in their conversations, Ralph and Marilyn would explore what she was picking up from people she just met. For example, Walter Matthau's wife. They were all at a party. And she said, I never realized until I got to talking to her, such and such, you know. But I had this sense about her. It was all positive, you know, it was good things. But Marilyn really had this whole thing about ESP. And she followed a horoscope. And there was a guy that was reported, Carol Richter, who was reported to, you know, he was a syndicated columnist to horoscopes. And I tell in the book about how he met her at a party sometime and said, well, you know, you were born under the same sign as, and he listed a bunch of celebrities. And Marilyn kind of rebuffed him and said, well, I was also born under the sign of, and she rattled off all these great thinkers, you know, that were very cerebral, distinguished people in history. So she preferred to be elevated to that status.
Yeah, I remember that story now that you say it. She had to struggle for recognition or understanding that she was a very intelligent person. She was never given credit for that. And that's one of the reasons why she wanted to break away from that stereotypical dumb blonde thing. It didn't serve her well because her intellect was neglected. I mean, look at the people she made friends with. Robert Frost and who was there's
a whole list in my book, all these authors that wrote her even fan letters. She got to know some of these authors who literally were writing her letters and wanting autographs or wanting to invite her to a party or whatever.
Who was the author, the woman? She would have lunch with her, and she was an author who was actually kind of dying of alcoholism, basically. Yes. Who am I thinking of?
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm going to cheat a little bit because that is in a press release that we just sent out recently. If I can get my computer to do this for me.
Oh, that's okay.
Because Marilyn had a cerebral side that people don't give her credit for. It's rarely mentioned in other books, and I think that's really neglectful when people don't give her due, because she did have this. And think about it. This is a woman that dropped out of school when she was 16. So she wasn't advanced. But also,
she was an autodidact. She taught herself.
She took night courses. She also attended classes at UCLA.
I know, I love that.
It's
world literature.
Jack Parr, who was in one of her films, and just an odious man, frankly, made some comments about she carried around all these books by intellectuals, but she didn't read any of them.
They were props.
Yeah, that was completely false. I have my little list that I'm calling up here as soon as my computer cooperates.
This is driving me crazy because I can see the picture in my mind's eye, you know.
Okay, I'll just read from the press release a little bit. She had 400 books in her home library, and they covered works of literature, art, drama, biography, poetry, politics, history, theology, philosophy, and psychology. Included were books by James Joyce, Walt Whitman, Saul Bellow, whom she had lunch with one time in Chicago, by the way,
Oh, that's
and
interesting.
John Milton. She was friends with authors Truman Capote, whom she danced with, strolled around New York with, gossiped about a particular family with. Carl Sandburg, of course, Carson McCullers.
That was who it was.
Isaac Dennison, who wanted to meet her. Isaac Dennison was also very ill.
Yeah.
And there's a picture of Marilyn being kissed by Carson McCullers. They all got together for a very fancy lunch.
Yeah, that's the picture I was trying to find. I couldn't find
one
it.
of the pictures in the book. Also, John Steinbeck wrote her a fan letter. She had books on gardening. She had a copy of The Little Engine That Could that somebody gave her. She went to poetry readings, concerts, attended plays.
Well, you have a picture in the book of her writing poetry.
Yes. Well, we have, this one's been seen before, but Carl Sandburg, maybe I can.
Yeah, that really struck me, that she would be.
He said she was very down to earth. She's the kind of person that if she was at your house as a guest for dinner, she'd help do dishes, didn't have to be asked. So she was quite a cerebral person. I hope that people realize that in the book, it's not just 417,000 words, which there are in that book. There are many, many, many photos, a lot of rare photos. If people didn't read the book, but just looked through the photos,
oh, I love the
they
pictures,
would find
yeah.
a lot. And I don't know why authors don't do this, but I thought it was relevant to place the photos so they were strategically adjacent to the copy that was being
I noticed that.
Story that was being talked about. And here we go. This is she's getting a kiss from Carson McCullers, and Isaac Dennison looks on. Let me move a couple things around here so I can see them.
Well, what page is it?
It is page 294. There's the picture.
Oh, it's not in my book.
Yes, it is.
No, 294?
I might have misread that.
Yeah.
If it wasn't, I want to know what kind of book you had. 194, I'm sorry.
194.
Yeah, it's 194.
I thought maybe I had an updated edition or something.
Yeah,
here it is. Exactly. Yeah. This is exactly the picture I was thinking of. Who would have thought, going by stereotypical notions, and this would be me because until I read this, I really knew only the stereotype. Who would have thought that she would be the kind of person that really icons of the literary world befriended her? That's so interesting to me. Well, when you're that smart, when you're that prolific a writer, an erudite person, you don't choose to hang out with people that are airheads unless they're hilarious. You want somebody who's going to meet you on a level, right? And they sought her out. I think that's
and they detected something about her, didn't they? I mean,
significant.
Just a persona. But Carson, for example, was known for The Heart is a Lonely Hunter.
Yes.
Which may ring a bell with some people.
Yeah.
She was partially paralyzed from a stroke, addicted to alcohol and pills. She was an invalid by 35, but she was then, when Marilyn knew her, she was 42.
Oh, her books are her stories are just devastating. I mean, talk about Southern noir. I mean, just really tough topics. Yeah. But
that she decided to hold this little luncheon and invited other literary greats. It was really for Marilyn. And this was just a common occurrence. Marilyn didn't have to take a back seat to anybody. And this nasty comment from Jack Parr, consider the source. Jack was quite the egomaniac. He walked out on his show one time.
Yeah, who was he interviewing that he walked out on? I remember.
Well, he walked out because they were reprimanding him for having talked about something that you're not supposed to talk about at that time on television. But what I didn't like about him, you could see some of the reruns. He was very fidgety, and he constantly interrupted the guests to edify himself. I thought that's not the way to behave. But you know, it's funny. You can see the men that are the most insecure in Marilyn's life, can't we? And I don't know why Tony Curtis leaps to mind. But Tony also made a career after he had no career left by appearing on various talk shows like Larry King Live and claiming, among other things, that he had an affair with Marilyn. He even claimed that while she was alive. And in her notes, she wrote derogatory things about him and said, unfortunate for him, he'll never have the chance, or something like that. It was a note to herself.
That's why he was nasty about it.
Yes, of course. And
couldn't take the rejection.
And James Haspel confronted him on camera when he was talking about how Marilyn was a boulevard hooker, which is also picked up by this other guy, Mr. Spoto, that put that in his book. Like Marilyn was just to get lunch during the early days, was cruising the streets and being picked up by
I remember that. Yeah.
You see, that's, people don't even have a real concept, I don't think, of just what challenges that Marilyn faced. We know about some of her health issues and so forth, and her background of being basically an orphan. But people could be very cruel to her. And that, like my grandmother used to say, the birds only peck at the good fruit on the trees, which is kind of true. And so if you've achieved anything in life worth, of any significance, you always got critics. But some of these people were brutal. And Marilyn treated things with such equanimity and poise. She did not fire back. There was one woman, that columnist, who wrote a nasty article, pardon me, about Marilyn. And a friend of hers said, wow, if I were you, I'd claw her eyes out. And Marilyn said, I thought it was crueler to leave her face the way it is.
I love that. That's great.
Marilyn, what's missing is, unless you read the book, she was so witty. So many people said that, and some cerebral people and common, ordinary people comment. She was so witty.
Very funny person.
And a lot of those are
quick-witted, yeah.
Absolutely. So this is an incredible woman.
Well, I think you're probably fully aware of this. I think most people actually are aware of the fact that the most insecure people are the ones who lash out, and professions that attract notoriety, fame, money, attract the weak of character for some reason. People who need to feed their ego, they're narcissists.
Well, are jealous, like Joan Crawford?
Oh, Joan Crawford. Every story you ever hear about her, what a horrible person.
Well, there is that little thing, Mommy Dearest, also,
Oh, I know my children like to remind me all the time. They'll say, yes, Mommy Dearest, no more wire hangers.
Well, have they taken all the wire hangers away from you? I'm just curious. But no.
Yeah.
But that's a story for another time. Hilarious. We'll do true confessions, and then we'll get to the heart of this matter. But
planting seeds of doubt.
Well, Joan Crawford, I think the story, and it is in my book, that Joan Crawford ran across Marilyn somewhere. I know that she was also at the home of the gentleman that used to hold the Sunday dinners, whose name I can never pronounce. Joe Schenck.
Joe Schenck. I talked to you about him.
She told Marilyn afterwards, the outfit you were wearing was completely inappropriate. And if you would just come to my house, I could give you some pointers on fashion. So Marilyn, reluctantly did go to Joan's house, soon discovered she had more on her mind than helping Marilyn with her wardrobe. But they went through the wardrobe, and she was making suggestions. And it ended up with Joan Crawford saying, well, why don't you go home and make a list of the things in your closet? And then I'll tell you what's suitable and what isn't. And Marilyn confessed that the only formal dress she had in her closet was one piece of apparel. And she was reluctant to admit that to Joan. But Joan, having felt rebuffed on a couple of levels, not just as a fashion consultant, started sniping publicly in the press about Marilyn. And when Marilyn showed up at a industry function where theater operators were invited and 20th Century Fox had, a big reception for them. She had a very compelling outfit when she walked in the door, and Joan was jealous. So she said, people want women in Hollywood to be beautiful, yes, but they want them to be ladies. And Marilyn was no lady. And she criticized her so much that the studio publicity department got the idea to dress Marilyn in a potato sack.
That's right.
And she still looked great in the potato sack.
Yeah.
And Marilyn commented later that, they, bought a big sack of potatoes. You can't trust those publicity guys in the publicity department, because I didn't get any of the potatoes. They ate all those potatoes and never gave me any of them. But it was a brilliant strategic move.
Oh, yeah.
To counter the criticism of Joan Crawford.
Yeah.
Because that picture of Marilyn fetchingly dressed in a potato sack for the dress went all over the world via the wire services and was in every daily newspaper in the country, So,
can you imagine what Joan Crawford went home and threw against the wall?
Well, not only that, she continued to be sniping, even in 1962, against Marilyn. And Marilyn finally did speak out a little bit and said that she felt that Joan's comments were said in haste, and she probably thought better of them when she'd had time.
Oh, please. I think we're getting an example these days. I'll leave it at that when you commit a narcissistic injury on a narcissist, they never forget and they never forgive. That's Joan, what's her name? Yeah.
There are people like that.
Yeah. Oh, there certainly are.
Well, and then there was Hedda Hopper was another one. And I like Paul Drake on her son, on Perry Mason, all the time. I watch it all the time.
Is that a mind
mother?
blower?
It's hard for me to understand his mother with Hedda Hopper, but Hedda could be so vicious to everybody, including Marilyn. Oh my God, she lectured Marilyn. Yet she would be nice. And one time Marilyn invited her to her New York apartment, treated her like royalty, and Hedda wrote a very nice column about her and said, to her credit, Marilyn never holds grudges. She realizes I am just making constructive criticism of her. What Hedda didn't know is that there was correspondence, which I have copies of, between Marilyn's attorney and her, contemplating a lawsuit against Hedda.
Yeah.
She'd also freelanced for a magazine, and it was by any objective legal standard libel.
Oh.
And they said, we're ready to sue her, but Marilyn decided not to. So Marilyn played a role that day too in appeasing and soothing Hedda Hopper on her visit to her apartment.
I always thought these stories are really sad. There are so many moments in her life when she bends over backwards to be a person of grace to some terrible person, and I don't know. She continued to do that her entire life. I can't remember the specifics, but that's a perfect example where she had the opportunity to really be snide or publicly biting or malicious, and she never did.
Helen, that's one of the first things I discovered about Marilyn. You asked me in our first interview how I got onto Marilyn, and I kind of bungled that question, veered off in another direction somehow. But I became interested when I did a story for Midwest Today, the magazine for which I served as publisher and editor for 26 years. It was on Marilyn's Midwest connections. Mm-hmm. And there were some, her half-sister Bernice Miracle lived in Detroit, Michigan for a while. Marilyn went there to meet her. Marilyn went to Beaumont, Illinois. We should talk again about Lincoln. I got to get back to that for a big Lincoln exhibit. Anyway, I researched Marilyn at that time, and I was most struck by her graciousness. We know about actresses that are beautiful women, and they are total, well, let's just say it rhymes with
egos.
Rhymes with itch.
Exactly.
And really first class, and just horrible women in real life. But I was so struck by Marilyn not being that.
Yeah.
And yet I saw some of these books that I was perusing that just continued beating up on Marilyn. And I thought, this does not compute. They're portraying her as dating gangsters, which she never did. And I report that and I explain that. There were lookalike women that James Haspel cited, whom he knew, who were impersonating Marilyn.
Yeah, that
And
was
you
so
could be
interesting.
across
Yeah.
the room at the Brown Derby or whatever, kind of low lighting. Oh my gosh, there's Marilyn. Look who she's with, Johnny Roselli or whatever. And it really wasn't Marilyn at all. And these women they're even in newspaper articles at the time, they would learn her mannerisms and so forth. They would go out and they made careers out of impersonating Marilyn. So a lot of these stories that showed up in other books about how she was dating this, it never happened, because if it really did happen, there'd be a huge firestorm. After all, they didn't withhold information when Lana Turner was dating a mobster. And other people would have been big news if they could have ever verified.
And what wasn't one of the Andrews sisters was dating a mobster? Am I getting that wrong?
Yes, yeah. The Chicago mobster, Sam Giancana.
Yeah,
yeah. Well, it was the McGuire sisters, wasn't it? I always get confused about that. I shouldn't.
I think you're right. You know, it was before my time.
McGuire
But
and
yeah.
So, so that would have been big news. But anyway, Marilyn had a childhood fascination with Lincoln, and even as an adult had a large portrait of Lincoln above her bed in her New York apartment, as confirmed by a number of people that had seen it.
Now, didn't she say to somebody, I seem to recall this, that that someday JFK would go down in history as an equivalent, on the same level of stature?
She said that to a British interviewer,
as
one
Lincoln.
of the last interviewers that summer.
Weird, huh?
Said it that summer, yeah, like in June or July.
Yeah.
I have that anecdote and the reporter in my book.
Yeah.
And she admired Lincoln so much that, of course, meeting Carl Sandburg, who wrote about Lincoln, a couple of books, was another tie-in. But she became aware that Beaumont, Illinois, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that was actually the site where Lincoln and Douglas had met to plan.
Oh, right. And
they were having a celebration that she found out about, complete with a beard judging contest, because Lincoln grew the beard. And Marilyn decided she was going to go. So she invited Eve Arnold, the photographer, along. And Eve Arnold had a great series of pictures of Marilyn's time there. And they really, again, took advantage of her. She was going there kind of on a low-key basis, wasn't trying to make a big deal out of it. In other words, let her have a little time to indulge an interest of hers.
Well, it was like a personal field trip, right?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. And yes, she was allowing the photographer to come along, but she didn't have a whole host of public events. But she did alert people that she was going to be there and asked them to please keep it quiet. She didn't want a mob scene, but of course they betrayed her trust. They dragged her around to this place and that place. Eve Arnold commented on it later and said that, she was really put upon by the people that were there, the hosts, not the citizenry, but the hosts. And yet she kept her cool and in a good-natured fashion.
Well, she was gracious about it.
And had continued going through this whole ordeal. But she just really wanted, and yet she also gave an interview about Lincoln and what Lincoln meant to her.
So what
was
it about Lincoln? That just seems like such a...
She almost thought of him as the father figure because she was lacking one. She knew he was an honest and trustworthy man, the rail splitter, and no doubt had absorbed enough from her school studies, even though she dropped out at age 16, that she had absorbed enough about Lincoln that she grew to admire him, which so many people have, I mean, me included. So she enjoyed that trip, I'm sure, to Illinois, but it was really kind of odd. Here's a picture I wanted to share with you. This is a soldier that was there, a young Navy man that she encountered in Beaumont, Illinois.
Oh, yeah, I remember that picture.
And I think she made his day. What do you think?
Probably.
You know,
Something to tell his
and
grandchildren
she
about.
was also giving the interview, the radio interview. You can see a bust of Lincoln
Oh
next to the
yes,
picture there.
yes, right before, yeah.
But anyway, she had this thing about Lincoln, and it's curious to me because there's a photograph. I don't have it in the book, but maybe you've seen it. And she is she's posing in the big Cadillac, the big 54 Cadillac, the black convertible
Yeah,
Cadillac
the gift, yeah.
that Jack Benny gave her because 20th Century Fox had in their contract she could not accept any payment for any other
Right,
shows.
right.
And they had tried to stop her appearance on Jack Benny's show, but fortunately Jack prevailed. So in lieu thereof, he gave her a brand new Cadillac. And there's a picture of her holding up a picture of Lincoln in that Cadillac. So I don't know where she got that big picture, but it's a very handsome picture of Abraham Lincoln, portrait of Lincoln, and she treasured that. I often wondered what happened to that. I don't think that ever ended up on a list. Of course, that would have been in the New York apartment. And the thing after Marilyn died, they did immediately go to the apartment under orders from her attorney, and they seized her fur coats and jewelry and did put those in storage. But I never saw a list of things for the other, like the furnishings in her apartment. Yet we know a lot of that survived and ended up in the hands of Lee Strasberg, regrettably.
We're going to have to talk, that one of the next times that we talk, we'll get to that part of the chronology.
Right.
We're really going to have to talk about what happened to things that belonged to her after she died. I thought that was horrifying. I, in my past, have taken care of elderly people, like on a one-on-one in their homes. And I've been struck by two things. And this is literally true. Members of the family that I didn't meet until the day the person died. And
suddenly they show up. Yeah.
It's like the vultures descending and waiting for the corpse to cool. It's unbelievable. And it's very, very common. And then the divvying up of the material possessions is the ugliest thing that you'd ever want to see. And I find it poignant or heartbreaking, both, that happened.
She left in her will that Lee Strasberg was to divide her personal effects among those whom she cherished, that she admired, and he didn't.
Yeah.
He kept it.
Yeah, it's a horrible story.
99% of it, according to the court.
Yeah.
There are actual court documents addressing this.
Yeah.
And of course, when Paula died, I'm previewing the next time we talk about her, his next wife, Anna Strasberg, was 38 years younger. Anyway, inherited all that, and it brought in millions and millions and millions of dollars.
Oh, it's just disgusting. Yeah.
I hope you have not run out of tape. I looked at the clock just now, and
well, I think we need to save something for the next time. I think we want to address two major topics, and I'm sure there'll be more that'll occur to me. I mean, pages and pages of notes here. I really want to talk about the circumstances of her final days. And then I also want to talk about the significant, and we're going to have to work on vocabulary here that doesn't get us in trouble, but the significant relationships around her that intersect with her final days. There are two huge topics, and there's a Venn diagram, which is a third huge topic. You know what I'm referring to. And I think that's what people are really, really, really interested in.
Well, what I want to say, and I know this sounds like a just terrible, I'm hawking my book here, but I can tell you that everybody that thinks they know a lot about Marilyn's death, the events leading up to it, and the events afterwards, and the actual death, are in for a big shock.
Yeah, I was utterly shocked because
I'm going to tell you this in 60 seconds or less.
Yes,
I had an advantage over other authors in the sense that millions of newspaper pages have been digitized in recent years. You must realize a lot of these books that have been on the market have been out for 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
And they're still selling. Now we have, AI, we have a lot of opportunities to dig into things. So I was able to take month by month by month by month of Marilyn's life and dig up thousands of newspaper accounts. And it's amazing to me how much reporting was going on in the LA press at the time of her death, leading up to it. And I have assembled that in a chronological fashion.
Yeah.
And as I was telling you before we started this conversation, the gears mesh. It all meshes. There's
It's
nothing
unbelievable.
that doesn't mesh. It'll become such a vivid and clear picture.
Yeah.
What happened to Marilyn, and we can just basically say she didn't do herself in any regard,
No.
either intentionally or otherwise.
No.
That was done for her. And I have the chronology. I have things that will jump off the page at people, and they will just be staggered that this stuff has not been assembled until now, showing how things happened.
Well, I think you do a very good job of debunking a lot of the lies. There's so much misinformation.
Yeah.
And most of us who just barely are interested in the topic originally, it went over my head. I heard, you hear the tropes.
Yeah.
She was an airhead. She was stupid. She was a bimbo. She did drugs. It was at her own hand. You have to be careful of that word.
Not to interrupt you, I would just comment this way. There are a lot of websites and groups of people that are self-appointed experts. I guarantee none of them have done the kind of research I've done.
Oh,
I don't see many of them have written a book like that.
No.
Or any book. But
well, it's backed up by fact.
There are people that are emotionally invested in the belief that she did herself in, because on some level they can relate to that. And I think that they have considered doing something they think she did. And so it's important to them to hang on to these myths, even though they can be easily debunked. And any rational person would have discarded the mythology surrounding what happened to Marilyn. It's plainly obvious when you have all the forensic samples, except her liver and her blood, quickly, destroyed.
Well,
and I go into all the forensics of that.
Don't say more, because we want it to be a bit of a surprise, a bit of a cliffhanger. But I will say this, that you do an excellent job of citing chapter and verse. You have concrete references to real information that debunks so much of the misinformation and the lies that take us down an intentional path away from the truth. Mm-hmm. And I don't like to be manipulated. That made me really angry, and that's why I appreciated your book so much.
Well, a lot of it was laziness, because people were buying into the stereotype. Why not write a book to capitalize on her name and just repeat the stereotypical stuff? And when you don't know the answer, just make something up. No problem.
That happened a lot, I know, but I think there was a nefarious intent behind a lot of it.
Oh yeah, that's true too.
Yeah, and that's really.
And I name names in that.
I know.
I don't pull any punches. You can
I know.
And I go right directly after some of these authors, and I point out the lies that are absurd. Some of them have written more than one book, and they're still always the authorities on any of these so-called documentaries. And
But how would you know? Let's be honest, Larry. Unless you do a reading of a book that's this intensive, how would you know? Most people, like I said, over 90% of Americans, fewer than 2 books a year. Mm-hmm. People just don't know. And it's the sensational stuff that attracts episodes of television shows and documentarians.
And my argument is the truth is so much more sensational.
Oh my God.
Than a writer of fiction could ever create.
And without going into detail, I will say that we have to be careful. The alleged truth is so mind-boggling that people reject it. I think that has a lot to do with it. People cannot believe or do not want to believe that such a thing could possibly be true. I have no problem. I'm such a cynic.
Especially when you look around us today and the scandals that service, whether it be Hollywood or politics or whatever, or big business,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The psychopaths are under every rock.
Yes.
All right, we have to go. I really appreciate you taking so
I,
much time.
I sure hope you capture tape on this thing. You know, we've been
Yeah, it says
Oh my
it's
God.
recording.
Covered
Now,
a lot of
yeah,
it.
I've had some technical issues lately, and if this doesn't record,
Oh boy.
it's fine. It'll be good, and I'll make an extra copy just to be sure I don't lose it.
Well, the problem is, I think from videos that I've seen, people tune out after the first 3.5 minutes, regardless of the video. You know, they have no patience anymore. But you know what? The last thing I'll say today is my book is for readers, not browsers. So if you want a quick read, don't buy my book. Just don't buy it. I don't need the money. I don't need the book.
Well, they can watch my videos.
You can watch the video.
Watch my synopsis.
But even
yeah.
if you don't have the patience for that, buy one of the cheapo books and be self-deceived. It's okay with me.
Well, I'm very flattered that people often listen to my synopses of books while they're cleaning the bathroom or working in the yard or whatever, and I fully support that. I think it's great.
It's a great idea. The way you do it, especially.
It's fun. Well, you know what? It helped, believe it or not, because I'm abysmal when it comes to remembering facts. Facts, what are they? It helps me to remember to write things down. So when it's a story I'm interested in, I won't cover something I'm not interested in. I won't do it. So every once in a while, I'll hit on a bit of a dud. People are just not all that interested, you know. But this book, I got a lot of feedback, a lot of positive feedback. Yeah. So we will do this again and catch up with the rest of the story. Yes?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. People have been asking me. I've been waiting for, Larry's next video.
I thought the number one question you were going to ask me when we had our first interview was who took that cover picture? Remember when people were all asking about
it's in the book. It's in the book you talk about. Yeah. The guy who took it. It's the guy that came right before she died. He talked about her face being so luminous in the light when he took the picture.
Yeah, but this picture wasn't taken just before she died.
This is a younger picture?
Yeah.
Because they make reference to this picture.
The credits for some of the photos and things are in the back.
So who did it then?
Frank Poleni. He was the photographer that shot a lot of images of movie stars and so forth. And that was a less commonly seen picture. Maybe because it's a little bit nondescript. There a lot of photographers would shoot in color, even recognizing that black and white images were most likely all that was ever going to be distributed, as fans wrote in for autographs and that sort of thing. But it also gave them flexibility. If a magazine approached them, wanted to do a story on a stuff, they'd have it in their files. And nobody else has this color picture, I bet.
Well, it didn't occur to me to ask because I've never really given her any thought. And I wouldn't know this was unusual. That's interesting.
I'll tell you more about the cover and how it was selected another time. But anyway, I thought maybe that was because there were people in the comments or whatever asking who took that picture. And so I was just sure. See, I wasn't psychic at all that time. I thought that was your first
question. This is how sad I am. I don't remember those questions. Did I miss some questions? I usually respond to my people who comment,
Somebody did ask, more than one.
Oh. Well, I conveniently glossed over that. I don't remember.
Well, that's right. Anyway, it's a rare picture and it's contemplative. It's nondescript. I didn't want one of her throwing her head back and laughing. I actually did 6 different covers with different pictures, sent them to friends of mine, and I asked them to pick the one that they want. Everybody but one person picked this picture. I'm happy with it now.
It's remarkable, and it's remarkable how different she looked in pictures from one picture to the next, like a chameleon.
She knew exactly what she was doing.
Yeah. Well, she got a lot of practice when she was young, right?
Yeah.
Larry, thank you. I hope I didn't wear you out.
Oh, I got to go take a nap now, but no.
Yeah, me
I'm
too.
fine.
Now I have to go on a stupid walk. I don't even want to talk about it. They lie. They tell you this is the fantasy somebody tried to sell me on years ago. If you go every day and you commit to it, and you make it a part of your routine, it becomes a lifestyle choice and it gets easier. That's a huge, gigantic lie. And it gets harder and harder and harder to motivate yourself because any slight novelty that might have existed wore off years ago. So, yeah. Anyway.
Good luck with your walk, and hopefully
thanks.
we've captured something of value that people want to look at.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure we have. And buy the book, you guys. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. So interesting.
Also, as an ebook too. You don't have to buy the great big one. You can read the ebook and take it with you on your little Kindle.
Well, buy the real book, please. I'm so sad that people are not buying.
Only 18% of the sales are coming from America.
Who's buying it?
People around the world. Isn't that interesting?
Is there any one particular country that's better?
UK is the next, but we have Australia, we have India, we have a lot of countries. It's available worldwide.
But mostly English.
18%. Of course, that changes a little bit day by day, but not by more than a point or two. But 18% of the sales are going to American customers. The rest of the world is interested in Maryland. I guess people here are consumed by what's being shut down in the government next to it.
It really surprises me because I was under the impression that she was this huge icon.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's a bit of a subculture.
Could be.
Yeah, I don't know. What do I know?
Well, there are a lot of people that like her, but they're too lazy to. I know this speaks disparagingly of my potential readers. I don't need it to be like that. I promise you, there are many good people out there. But there are people out there that are, as I said earlier, looking for a quick read and it's easy answer and it confirms your long-held view of her. So go for it. Don't open your mind to anything new. That's the edict that some,
it's a mantra. Yeah, I know. Yeah. I think you're as cynical as I am. It's getting hard on a daily basis. All right.
Yes.
We'll end this now. And I just want to thank you very, very much for devoting your time for doing this. And
must have been the longest one you've ever done. I bet. I've set new records or something.
I don't think so.
Really?
No, it's close, but it's not the longest. I appreciate your patience with my faulty memory.
No.
I appreciate that. And
don't sell yourself short.
We'll do this again. Don't go away. I just want to thank everybody for watching.
Yes, I want to thank you too. Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. So thank you and stay tuned because this is part 2. Part 3 will be coming and wait
till we get to part 50. Now that's going to be the doozy. That'll be the year 2028.
Slungafoil, everybody. Slung.
Bye-bye.
Oh, I should say thank you to you.